Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this in one of our occasional Siegfried Sassoon Fellowship broadcasts. And tonight our subject is writing war biographies on the poets. And in a moment, I'll hand over to Phil, who will introduce our guests. Just some housekeeping to start with. We could ask if you could, those of you who are not speaking, go on mute. And depending on how many people join us, we may need to get video switched off, but we've got no idea at the moment how many are going to dial in. But if there's loads of people, it can sometimes unsettle the internet link. But I think we're all right to go at the moment. If you have any questions, please use the chat facility during the interview, and I can pick up on those later on. But the broadcast we're hoping will last probably about 45 minutes, the actual interview, and then we'll throw it over to questions, and then you're free to ask any questions after that. Okay, so I think without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Kate. Right, good evening, everybody. This is a sort of a virtual representation of what I did a few years ago with Max and good old Dennis, if you remember. But we have, as a substitute for Dennis, now we have Viv, and so we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm just going to introduce the two speakers and then put some questions to them, and some may just arise, and then again over to you. I'm going to start with Max Egremont, mainly because Max wrote that, of course, is the authorized biography of Siegfried Sassoon. And there are issues about that, or not issues, but there are strengths about that, which we can come to later. Hopefully that'll come out when we talk. Max Egremont started writing in the late 70s and wrote basically biographies of some great Victorian figures, people like Arthur Balfour. He also wrote 4 novels, which I think is quite interesting, and some poetry as well. But he was always interested in World War I and the effect that World War I had on the 20th century, what it led to in terms of Hitler and Stalin and all the rest. But of course, we know him primarily as the author of this biography of Siegfried, and he will talk to us about that in a little while. Viv Whelpton spent 38 years as a teacher. God, it's almost as long a sentence as mine, Viv. You know, I admire anybody who stayed that long at the coalface. Teacher of English and Media Studies, retired in 2006, and has obviously been writing articles, and she's an accredited battlefield guide, has an MA in War Studies. But again, tonight we have, it's primarily for her books on Richard Aldington that we're talking about, 2 different books. This is the second one, and we will get talking about that in a short while. So, no more ado, let's ask the questions really. And I'm going to start with Max. Max, how did you come to write what I've referred to as this authorized biography of Siegfried, please?
I came to write it. I became keen to do it many years ago. The first book that I wrote came out in 1977. And after that, I was looking around for another subject. And I'd always been very interested in Siegfried Sassoon and a great admirer of his. And I had a link to one of Siegfried's younger friends, to Geoffrey Keynes. So I wrote to Geoffrey, whom I didn't actually know at all. And I said that that I felt that there hadn't been a life of Siegfried Sassoon, and I wondered whether there was any chance of him talking to me about the possibility of doing one. And I got a very nice letter back saying that he wasn't sure if this would be possible or not, but would I like to come to see him? So I went to his house near Cambridge, and he was extremely nice to me. And he said he thought this was an interesting idea, but there were 2 people that he would have to talk to about it. The first would be to Rupert Hart Davis, who was supposedly the literary executor. And the second was George Sassoon, Siegfried's son. Now, he put Hart Davis first. He said Hart Davis is really the gatekeeper to Sassoon. And so he would write to him, and he suggested that I should go and see him. And so he wrote to Rupert, as I later called him, because I later got to know him extremely well. And again, I got a letter back from Rupert saying, come up and see me, but I'm afraid this is quite impossible at the moment. And so I went to see him. He lived in Yorkshire then, and he was nice to me. Well, he was only quite nice to me. He obviously wanted to warn me off, so to speak. And he said, there's absolutely no question of anybody doing a life of Sassoon for a very, very long time. And by implication, and certainly not you. So I felt slightly hurt by this, but I accepted it. After all, I was very young. And so I thought, well, that's that. And there was no question, curiously enough, George, who was very much alive then, well, I mean, obviously quite young then, there was no question at all of George coming into the discussion whatsoever at this stage. George, Siegfried's son, these two men essentially were the two gatekeepers. It was like two lodges at the end of a drive. It was Geoffrey Keynes on the one side, there was Rupert Hart Davis on the other. So I went away and I thought, well, that's that, you know, I have to do something else. So I wrote A Life of Arthur Balfour, and I wrote certain other things. But then I had an extraordinary piece of luck. There's a great scientist called Miriam Lane, and two of her children happened to have been at Oxford with me, her son Charlie and her daughter Charlotte. And I was talking about Sassoon to them and to her, curiously enough, because I got to know them extremely well. And she said, well, I knew him extremely well because I was a great friend of Hester Gatty, whom he married. And I said, well, I've always been passionately interested in him, and I feel there hasn't been a biography of him. And if there was any chance of me getting to see George, or getting to see the papers, which I knew had been closed for many years, I would be very grateful. And so she said she'd write to George, and George, being a scientist himself, was extremely respectful of her, although their interests were completely different. George was interested in electronics, really, whereas Miriam's great interest was fleas. So there was a difference. Fleas? But she wrote to George, and George said, well, I know absolutely nothing about this man Egremont. Perhaps he ought to send me a book that he's written. So I sent him a copy of a book that I'd just done, which was a biography of a man called General Spears. And George said, well, George got in touch with me and said, well, if you know Miriam, of course, you know, I'd be keen to meet you and to see you, but I can't promise anything. And he divided his life then in between two places. He had a house in Wiltshire, quite near Heytesbury, and he also had a property up in the Hebrides on the island of Mull. And he said, I'll be in Mull, so you can come and see me. There's a very long way to go. So I thought, well, all right. I went up to Mull and I got on the ferry, and I saw, as the ferry came into Mull, I saw this man who looked incredibly like Siegfried Sassoon. And I thought I was seeing a vision. Good heavens, this is the man I want to write about. Here he's here. I thought he was dead. But there was George, and George took me to his house. And I felt there was some sort of test going on, because the first thing that George did was to offer me enormous quantities to drink. And I think he associated people who wanted to write about Siegfried Sassoon, rather wet people who weren't able to hold their drink. So I felt it was very, very important for me to be able to establish my relationship with him by being able to show that I could cope with this immense, huge quantity of alcohol that was poured all over me from every whiskey, beer, every sort of thing. And so we got through the lunch with this huge quantity of alcohol. I just about kept up. And then he said, well, look, we've got to drive to the ferry now, and I will take you to the ferry. And so I got into the car with him. And we arrived at the ferry port, which was a place called Craigniur. And George said, oh, we're a bit early, but look, there's a pub just round the corner. We'll go there and we have another drink. And so, again, vast quantities of draft beer were consumed in this pub, which time I was almost legless. And anyway, he helped me onto the ferry. And on the way back to Oban, I was really in a practically catatonic state. In an extraordinary way, I must have passed the test. And I have to say that I liked George immediately. And I found him completely different to what Rupert and Geoffrey had told me about him. They were deeply shocked that he'd sold a lot of his father's papers and that he didn't seem interested in his father. I found he was deeply interested in Siegfried Sassoon, and he was also highly intelligent. And I got a letter about 3 days later saying, I think this would be an interesting project. And so that was how it got going. And I got to know him extremely well. And I certainly couldn't have written a book without him. And he died not that long after the book came out, and I still think often about him, and I revere his memory. It's not easy being the son of a extremely well-known and very celebrated figure. Yeah. And George, I think, suffered from this, but I have enormous affection for him and enormous respect for him as well.
Can I ask, just before I move on, it appears, being a literary biographer, you have to be able to drink. You need to have hollow legs.
You do.
No, I can only think of I can only personalise it. I wrote a biography of a Welsh writer called Herbert Williams, and we went out to the pub at lunchtime and didn't re-emerge for 3 days. You know, it's like the lost.
Yes.
You know, so I can empathise with what you're saying, Max. But the question I wanted to ask: why was Rupert Hart Davis so vehemently opposed to you writing that biography?
Well, the major problem, I can understand that, because the major problem when I went to see him, which was in 1977, was that Stephen Tennant was still alive. And therefore it was quite hard to get to the bottom of the relationship that they had while Stephen was still living. In fact, I knew Stephen a bit, so I didn't think that would have been too difficult. But Rupert always had a great sense that it wasn't really necessary to go too deeply into people's private lives. For instance, he wrote a biography of Hugh Walpole without any mention of the fact that Hugh Walpole was a homosexual.
Yes, okay.
The extraordinary thing was that he was very proud of this. He said to me, I remember once, he said, you know, I wrote that biography of Hugh Walpole. I said, yes, I know it. I know it. And he said, you know, I never said that he was a homosexual. And I said, well, sure, that was rather a key part. No, it wasn't at all important. He said,
there's no answer to that.
I love it.
Thank you, Max. We'll come back in a minute. I'm going to turn to Viv, if I may, please. Viv, okay, you've written these 2 books on Richard Aldington. A question. Max was telling us there about how he got to know George Sassoon and how important that was to him in the writing of the book. Did you get to actually meet members of Aldington's family? And if so, was that important to you?
Well, it's interesting what Max says about luck, because I think luck is a really major player in all this. And in my case, Max won't remember, but I wrote to him in 2007 as Spears's biographer to ask him if he knew if anyone was working on Mary Borden, Spears's wife, and who her literary trustees were. And I established from Max and from then getting in contact with the trustees that there was someone working on Mary Borden. So I abandoned that idea. And Aldington interested me. He'd interested me ever since I realized how much my students enjoyed his poetry and were moved by it. But Jean Moorcroft Wilson was working on Aldington at the time. And then in 2009, at the time when her Rosenberg was published, she decided, having got far into the project that she would rather do Edward Thomas. So she said to me, if you want to do Audington, I'm not going to do him anymore.
We'll parcel him off.
Yes. So I picked up the project, but in 2012, when my proposal was shortlisted for the Tony Lothian Prize, I went to the awards dinner. Incidentally, I didn't win the prize, and I was placed next to someone called Jane Conway, who turned out to be Mary Borden's biographer. She'd self-published her biography of Mary Borden, which again, is an issue and a problem. She couldn't find a publisher, and it's a wonderful book. But not only was she Mary Borden's biographer, but her husband was the cousin of Jennifer Audington, Audington's niece. So 2 weeks later, Jane and I were on a train to Deal to go and meet Jennifer Audington, who turned out to be the most delightful person. She was crippled with arthritis, in constant pain, but just so lively and warm and witty, and absolutely adored Audington. She and her brother, whom I subsequently met, who lives in Italy, had met him quite late on in his life. But Jennifer had quite a lot of letters from him, which she shared with me. And she was just a delight to know. Unfortunately, tragically, she died in November 2019. But the obvious person for me to connect with was Catherine Audington, Audington's daughter. Jean had met her, but by the time I started the project, she was terminally ill. And all I was able to do, I had to send a question once a fortnight to her literary trustee, Audington's literary trustees. They would forward it to Catherine, and at a prearranged time, I was able to ring her at her home in the south of France, and she would talk about that particular question.
It was as clinical as that?
It was as clinical as that, because that was all she could cope with at that stage. Yeah. And it was really very little use at all. In fact, it was too soon for me to talk to someone. And I think it's really important to try and establish contact with people who knew your subject, but you've got to know your subject quite a lot before you make that contact, I think.
And is that a judgment that the writer has to make? You know, when to make contact with people who knew that subject?
Yes.
Right.
Those were the only people that I could make contact with.
Okay. Do you feel that you knew Audington well at the end of when everything was done, when the book was written? Did you feel that you knew him well?
I did. I had a lot of correspondence. His correspondence, not the letters he received from others because he never kept them, but his own correspondence. The recipients had been scrupulous about keeping them and then selling them. So I did read an awful lot of his letters, and it was quite late on in the second volume that I talked to a friend, an old friend who's a clinical psychologist, and he said to me, have you thought of looking at attachment theory as the clue to Audington? And that suddenly opened everything up.
Yeah.
I suddenly realized that this man who had apparently civilized middle-class upbringing actually had had no bonding as a child, and that had affected his whole development. And
as an ad and as a writer.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And his ability to cope with the war. The First World War was traumatic for any infantryman. For someone who came to it already damaged, then getting over it was never going to be a possibility, really. Yeah.
We'll come back to that, if we may, in a little while, Viv. I'll come back to Max, if I may now, please. Max, Viv was talking there about the effect of the war, the First World War, on people who took part. Now, you've obviously had a long interest in World War I. what do you think is the significance of Sassoon to our understanding of the First World War?
It's enormously significant. I remember the first time that I read the poems when I was a teenager, I thought this was what the First World War was like. And then the prose books, of course, are so mesmeric. They're so beautifully written that they conjure up a picture of the war, whether it's absolutely true. It seems to be so accurate and so unforgettable. And the whole story of the objection to going back and the letter and the time at Craig Lockhart, it's one of the stories that I think has really formed so many people's view of the war and the way these innocents were sacrificed front, whether it's right or not. I know it's been challenged extremely strongly by certain historians, but it's still very, very powerful, I think.
I just wonder if I think it was somebody once said, Philip Larkin, I think, said that if Gerard Manley Hopkins had been a survivor from the Deutschland, we have had a very different poem and a different perspective of that disaster. And I mean, Sassoon, Owen, Rosenberg, they were right in the forefront of this fight. I mean, would we have had a different view, do you think, if they hadn't been so right at the front, if they'd been that little bit removed, that little bit objective? Would it have been better? But it would certainly have been different, wouldn't it?
Well, I think that would be for Viv to talk about, perhaps.
We'll come and ask.
Would you like?
Viv, and thank you, Max. Just a second, transfer straight to Viv. He managed to sign up that question, Viv, so we passed it to you, I'm afraid.
Right. So what you're asking is whether being a participant.
Yes. Being a participant, Max believes, and I tend to agree with him, that our view of the war has been shaped by Sassoon, by Owen, and all of those people. How would they have written, and what would it have been like? Or what would Aldington have been like, if he had been that little bit removed from the war, not having to endure the trenches and everything that they did? Would it have been better? Would it have been worse?
Would it have been authentic? That's
Yes.
the big question,
Yes.
isn't it? I mean, it seems to me that we're fascinated by the combatant experience, and rightly so, I think. And only they can tell us about that.
But not so much the Second World War. Do you think? I mean, I find it quite interesting that the poets of the First World War and the poets of the Second World War, we don't think of the poets of the Second World War with perhaps the same veneration, for want of a better word.
I think one of the problems is that the really fine poets of the Second World War died quite early on, whereas those of the Second World War either survived or were there up till the end, near the end.
Yeah.
Rosenberg and Owen dying in 1918, for instance. Yes, but I mean, there is very fine prose writing from Second World War combatants, isn't there?
Well, Alan Lewis is the obvious one. Some of his
Yes.
stories about India are absolutely magnificent.
Yes, yes.
And of course, Lewis died during that campaign in Burma in 1944. But his poetry about the Second World War is also quite significant.
Yes, yes, yes.
It was just an interesting point. Sorry, it was totally aside. I'm sorry about that.
No.
Max, for throwing that back to you.
Sorry.
Sorry, Max.
Yes.
You've written about other subjects, obviously, but you've also been a fiction writer. Are there any similarities between writing literary biography and fiction writing?
Well, I think there is a certain similarity in that you're telling a story. I think both consist of telling stories. When you write a biography, of course, people say that a biographer is a novelist who is writing on oath, so to speak, in that he has to stick to the truth. that he can find, or that he or she can find through the research that he or she does. And I think there is a similarity there. I think fiction, you're completely free, so to speak, which has its advantages and its disadvantages, in that it's more difficult to make a structure, I think, from fiction, whereas the life is starts with the moment the subject is born and goes up to the time the subject dies. So the structure is already there. Whereas with a novel, it is more difficult. You have to discover a structure that is going to be satisfactory for the story and the theme. So there is a difference there. But I think I think we have to come back to this idea of a story and a narration, which I think the two share.
Yeah, I mean, I always think, thinking about it, the elements of a good novel, three of what I call the 3 Ps: place, people, problem. Those are also hugely significant in writing literary biography, I think. You know,
Yes.
it may be there for you, but you've still got to develop that and use it, really.
Yes, and I think that trajectory from birth to death is a problem for a biographer, because actually you want to find a structure, a narrative that has a different kind of shape if you can. And that's quite a challenge, I think, having evidence in front of you and trying to shape it into a narrative.
But holding to the truth the whole time.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because that's the temptation, isn't it? You know, if I'm writing about somebody and think, well, it's been a bit of a boring year, let's stick something juicy in there. But that's the fiction writer in me. So I don't know. That was never a temptation for you, Viv, was it?
Oh, I think it is. I think too that there's much more flexibility these days for biographers. That one can be a little bit more subjective. I've just been reading Lucasta Miller's new biography of Keats, and at times I've been irritated by its subjectivity, but it's exciting and interesting. And I think that searching for a story, you know, what it is that's exciting is important, really.
And it is telling a story, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Yes.
That storytelling element should never be forgotten.
No.
Max, will you go back to writing fiction at all?
Well, I think I would like to think that I would. Yes, I think that the joy about fiction in a way is that you try to keep the interest up, whereas inevitably, perhaps particularly in the life of a writer, there are moments when he or she is not really doing very much. They're busy writing their books, and so it's quite hard to keep the interest going, so to speak. Whereas with fiction, you can suddenly create an incident or a character that perhaps does keep the interest there. So, and of course, the freedom is also quite intoxicating, I have to say, as well.
Well, the freedom within a piece of fiction.
The freedom in fiction, that you can really go in whichever direction that you want. That's a great challenge, of course, too. And you can very easily take a wrong turning.
I mean, Viv, what about? I mean, you obviously taught fiction during your time as a teacher. I mean, how about for you? I mean, how easy would it be to slip from truth to makeup in terms of being a literary biographer and then moving it on to something different? Because there is an awful lot of fiction around at the moment. I mean, obviously Cromwell and the Tudor period is the classic example, and people who might read that could well think that is what we're reading is genuine history, but it's not, is it? Or is it? I don't know. Do you think it is?
Yes, I think in writing biography, you are trying to find a narrative that's exciting. You're also, I think, trying to show how your subject is a product of their age. So that kind of social history and that kind of background and mean, just a simple example with Sassoon, the fact that that homosexuality was illegal at the time when he was living, all those things are influential, aren't they, in forming the behaviour of a character, of a person. So that's all got to be there, hasn't it?
Indeed. Okay, I'm coming to the end of my questions. We're going to, in a short while, open them up to the to the viewers. Before we go, what are you working on at the moment, Viv?
I'm working on someone called Briar, who was, when HD and Audington separated, HD and Briar became partners and remained so for the 40 years of HD's remaining life. She's a fascinating person. She was a writer herself. I used to read her novels when I was a teenager. She was transgender and very much into psychoanalysis. So she was able to recognize that fact about herself at a time when that was very hard to understand and to deal with. And she negotiated that. She was also the daughter of the wealthiest man in Britain. So she was extremely rich, and she negotiated that as well, how to manage her wealth in ways that were constructive and productive. So she was a great patron of the arts. And what made me want to do her in the first place, I had to write to her grandson, actually HD's grandson, but Briar had adopted HD's daughter, who was her literary trustee, for permission to publish letters in the Audington biography. And I found myself saying, I didn't even anticipate it, is anyone working on Briar? Because I'd really like to. And I thought, what made me think that? And it was the fact that when HD and Briar were first in a relationship, Briar demonized Audington. She was frightened, I think, of losing HD. And between them, they constructed this horrific picture of the man. But by the 1950s, she's supporting him. She's paying for his daughter's education. And all this is out of her love and loyalty for HD, because HD and Audington were by then in daily correspondence for the last 10 years of HD's life. And Briar wanted to do it for HD. So suddenly she's completely reversed her estimation of this man. And I think that's fascinating.
That's a story in itself, isn't it? I mean, you've got it there. I mean, I look forward to reading it.
If it ever gets published.
I'm sure it will. I mean, is there a problem getting publishers now for literary books?
Yes, well, you can't. Lutterworth, who published the Audington, are lovely, but they're an academic publisher. Yeah. This is less of a literary biography, although there is literature. It's more of a kind of mainstream biography, really. And if you want a mainstream publisher, you cannot submit to publishers. You've got to get an agent. And so far, I've not had any success.
Don't stop me on agents. I mean, but okay. I mean, but I will hopefully you can. We will find a publisher for it, because she sounds a fascinating character. She really does. Max, what are you working on at the moment, or are you working on anything at the moment?
Well, I moved really completely away from the First World War, and I wrote a book about East Prussia called Forgotten Land, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago, which was partly a travel book, partly history, dealing with various people who had lived in this part of Europe in the 20th century mostly. And I've just done another book going slightly further east in the Baltic about the same approach really to two of the Baltic estates, to Latvia and Estonia, and that's coming out on the 25th of July or the 22nd of July. So I hope you'll all dash to the bookshop.
Mark it down in your diary, folks. 22nd of July, we think, yes?
Yes, it's a great thing. That's right. Yes, yes.
Thanks very much. Okay, guys. Kate, I guess we come to you to actually do the next, to unblock people and to take questions.
Yeah, I think there's nothing in the chat box, so if anyone has any questions, then feel free. I'll start the ball rolling. I was going to ask Viv, some time ago. I think it was back in 2017. I had the great pleasure of attending one of your field trips out in France about Sassoon. And I wondered how that side of doing things, how that impacts on your work, you know, what value that has for you as a biographer to go to those sort of sites.
I think for writers like Sassoon and Owen, and of course we've done a Sassoon tour and we did an Owen tour in 2018, going there is absolutely vital. I think if you want to read a poem like Exposure, you've got to stand on the Redan Ridge at Munich Trench and see what happened. And the same with Sassoon, because of course it's not just Sassoon's poetry, it's his prose as well. To go to Bois Français and see where David Thomas was killed and so on and so forth is just so important. For Audington, I think it's like Gurney and Rosenberg. They were other ranks. They weren't officers. And their writing is on the whole about the experience in the rear. And so you get a frisson from standing on the spot where they stood, but you don't need it to understand the poetry in quite the same way, I think, as for all Owen, Sassoon, London. Yes, to go to Teatfall Wood is you can't really understand undertones of war without doing that, I think. So yes, so I think it depends. For some of them, it's just absolutely essential and just very moving as well, of course.
I think just to pick you up on that, I mean, I think the key for me about World War I poetry and World War II poetry is for what Alan Lewis called the landless soldier locked in war. And I think that's a beautiful expression of what they endured in the front line and the rear lines. And it's hugely important, I think, to actually go there, to actually see it. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I tried to persuade my publisher to send me to somewhere in Burma for honest writing about Lewis. Hasn't agreed to it yet, but thanks. Kate, any more questions coming through?
Nothing else in the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to, if you're able to unmute if you have a question.
Kate, can I ask? I think I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are indeed, Meg.
Right.
Go ahead.
Hi. Viv, when I read the Aldington biographies, both of them, I got the impression that you weren't particularly sympathetic to Briar. So I'm very interested in the fact that you're now writing her life.
Yes.
You didn't seem to like her very much.
Well, she wasn't very likable in those early test stages.
Was Aldington, of course.
And very possessive. No, quite. But no, I think she did change, she did mature, and yes. And Audington, yes. But again, you can condemn someone's behaviour, but actually sympathise with the child who became the man capable of behaving that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this ties in with a novel again, doesn't it? You can read a novel about a good human being who does bad things.
Yes.
And indeed, many of Shakespeare's plays are about that too.
Yes. Yes, is that negative capability? Yes.
But I always say that you have to love your characters. When you're writing fiction, you have to love your characters. Even the most evil, foul, horrible creature God ever put on this earth, you have to, as a writer, as a creator of him, you have to love those characters. Would that apply in something like the literary biography that you and Max write?
Oh, I think so. Sorry, Max.
Do you what? I didn't hear. Sorry.
What I was saying, Max, was that writing fiction, I think you have to love your characters, even the most awful character. You have to love them. You have to have something for them, some affection for them. Would that be the same in literary biography?
Well, I don't think you have to love them. I think you have to understand them and feel a sympathy for them, perhaps. I think you can still perhaps dislike them, but you feel that you know the reason that they're dislikable. But I think the great thing about them is that they have to be interesting, and they have to, for instance, I wrote a life of a man called General Spears, and I wrote a life of Arthur Balfour. I didn't like Arthur Balfour particularly, and I didn't really particularly like spheres, but I became very interested in him and so intrigued by him that I wanted to know more and more about him. And for instance, somebody who writes the life of Evelyn Waugh, quite a dislikable person, but on the other hand, very interesting, very, very fascinating. And I think the fascination is what you really need.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's spot on. Anybody else? Huh?
Yes, if I may.
Of course, go ahead.
Hi, am I unmuted?
You are indeed.
Good. Viv, I was really struck earlier when we were talking about wanting to construct a coherent narrative from birth to death of the subject you're writing about. In Aldington's case, there are some absolutely key incidents. You and I have talked about this at lunch various times. There's some absolutely key incidents that we will never know the truth of. We'll never know exactly what happened. I'm thinking, of course, of the final break between Aldington and HD right after her daughter was born. And I'm also thinking of the question of why Aldington's second wife left him. And in both of those cases, we don't have documentary evidence. HD Aldington did not write down what happened in their final breach. Neither Aldington nor Netta ever wrote down what went wrong in that marriage. How do you, as a biographer, cope with that there are these absolutely key moments in the subject's life where there is simply we're just never going to know?
No. And Netta is a cipher anyway.
Yes, she is.
I had so little to go on. I didn't know her at all. You know?
Right.
But in the case of HD, I did rely on her fiction. And I think that was quite a controversial thing to do because, you know, there are so many roman à clef. There's D.H. Lawrence, there's Cornos, there's HD, there's Aldington. They're fiction, they're auto-fiction, as it's called these days, isn't it? And, you know, I thought that was more reliable than any memoirs, because when someone writes a memoir, they are presenting themselves as they wish to be seen. When they write a novel, they're often writing in the white heat of emotion. and I really did rely on those novels a lot for the relationship between HD and Aldington.
Right. But with Netta, of course, you don't even have the novel.
No.
Well, the book I'm working on Aldington, I get around that problem by simply stopping.
Yes.
With All Men Are Enemies, which is in the early 30s. I mentioned that he marries Netta later, but I don't have to deal with any of that because I'm not doing a biography. So I can just say, well, this is where my interest stops.
Yes.
But it must be very, very tempting to, how shall I put this?
Speculate?
Speculate, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not sure that's a question so much as just an observation. Yeah.
It's a good observation. I'll give you that. It's speculation leads to accumulation. I remember that. The thing is, as people are talking, it's coming to me. Increasingly in our society, the letter is becoming obsolete.
Yes.
Both Max and Viv have mentioned that they have read the letters of Aldington and Sassoon as an important element of their biography. What on earth happens when that letter disappears forever? People don't keep emails and they don't record telephone calls. Where does that leave the biographer? That's to Max and to Viv and to anybody who wants to make a comment on that.
I noticed that when Pinter left his archive to the British Library, it included all his emails.
Really?
Yes, and I think that's been an increasing tendency, but it is a worry. And actually, not just letters, but also photographs, because digital photography is so transient, isn't it? And you need photographs of people.
And also manuscripts.
Yes.
Speaking from the literary scholar's point of view, been working with John Stallworthy's magisterial edition of Owen. And of course, there one can look at the transcriptions of Owen's manuscripts. One can go online to the First World War Archive run by Oxford and look at Owen's manuscripts. And I've thought, as I'm working on my own writing, there are no manuscripts now. You know, I type a sentence, I backspace over it, I retype it, I backspace over it. There's no record kept. So the looking at, doesn't matter for me because I'm not a great author, but looking at the progression of thought in a poet, you know, being able to say, from this manuscript of Anthem for Doomed Youth to this one, to this one, to the final fair copy, we see Owen's thought progressing. That's going to be entirely lost with word processors, entirely lost.
That and Christmas Fires as well, says he. I once wrote a novel which was accepted by Victor Gollancz, and they came back to me on Christmas Eve with the comment, "We have changed our mind. We now think this is too dense, too dark. We are not going to publish." So I wrote them a stinking letter and said, "Have you so-and-so's never heard of Wuthering Heights?" And then having opened up a log fire, put the manuscript on the fire and burned it.
Oh.
So it's not just, it's also the temperament of the writer comes into things as well. And I'm sure Sassoon et al. Would have done the same.
Hello, Phil. This is
Deb has just said that Sassoon ripped lots of pages out of his diary for exactly that purpose. Sorry, I interrupted. Go on.
So yeah, I'm Austin. I'm on the phone, so I'll put it down so you have a view of my roof.
Got your roof. It's nice.
Yeah, I am here. Yeah,
but you had it then.
Yeah, there's a different side of this. I mean, I'm sort of, again, this is more of an observation, but we've got this cricketer who's sort of being pulled up now for what he wrote when he was 16 on Twitter or whatever. I don't know the details, and I don't particularly want to. And there's this idea that whatever you do now, it doesn't happen unless someone actually captures it. And once it's electronically captured, it never disappears. And in a way, that ties in with what Viv was saying about people writing their memoirs. And you know, how do you manage your social media presence going back to when you were 16? You know, again, to be facetious, if some of our current leaders had like, you know, social media or Twitter or whatever when they were 16, would that sort of change the way that they could present themselves when they write their memoirs? So not a lot to do with sort of, well, perhaps it is to do with biography. I don't know. Perhaps not literary biography.
I think it is to do with biography, isn't it? It has to be, Austin. Well, how would you feel about that? Would you agree that that's part and parcel of the biography?
Will the biographer have access to that material?
I don't know.
That would be interesting. Yes.
I mean, yes, Deb is shouting in my ear. Once it's on the internet, is that then into the public domain?
Oh.
I don't know
Case,
the answer to
yes,
that one.
all relevant material.
Yeah. It's interesting. That's an issue for another debate. I think we'll put that in future on that one. Okay, guys, is there any other questions that anyone wants to throw at us, please?
Could I ask a question, Max? You mentioned meeting Stephen Tennant. Now we've been regaled by Simon Blow about his memories of Stephen, and I've spent many happy hours listening to stories about Stephen Tennant, not all of which appear in Philip Hall's biography. I wonder if you might give us a reminiscence of Stephen.
Yes, well, I went down to Wiltford at the time that I was thinking about doing a biography of Sassoon in the 1970s, the first period, so to speak, of my investigations. And Stephen was perfectly happy to see me. And the first evening that I was there, he very kindly asked me to stay. He talked absolutely non-stop. And then he talked about Siegfried Sassoon, not a great deal, but he really talked about himself. And then he suddenly said, the time has come, I think, for us to listen to the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life. And I thought, oh my goodness, what's coming next? And he had a manservant called John. And he said, John, bring up the long playing record of Oklahoma. And so John brought up the record of Oklahoma. And John, put it onto the gramophone, will you? That's very kind of you. So John put the record onto the gramophone, and he said, put it to the track called Out of My Dreams. And so we sat through Out of My Dreams, and as that came to an end, he said to me, didn't you think that was the most beautiful thing you've ever heard in your life? And I said, well, that's not quite, but it was certainly very interesting, Stephen, and it interests me that you should be so moved by it. And he then said, then he said that the time has come to have something to eat. And so we sat down, and the first course came, and he said, now the second course, this is going to be absolutely wonderful. And he said, John, and again the man appeared, he said, John, bring up the fruit salad. So the fruit salad came up, and he said, this is going to be the best fruit salad you've ever eaten in your life. And I said, oh, how wonderful. I look forward to it very much. And it turned out to be fruit salad, very obviously from a tin. And he said, well, didn't you think that was the most delicious thing you've ever had? And I said, well, it was very interesting, Stephen, but I wouldn't have said it was the most delicious thing I've ever had. But then he talked absolutely non-stop. And then the next morning I came down and he was exhausted and he wouldn't really speak to me any longer. But I have to say, I could see how entertaining he was. I could also see that there was a silliness there as well, which was could be quite provoking. And of course, by that time, he was no longer such a handsome person as he had been, although he continued to dye his hair orange. And he put on an awful lot of weight. But I was very, very glad to have had this experience of him, because it added greatly to my appreciation of what the relationship that he and Sassoon had had. And I know Simon, of course, very well, Simon Blow. And he, of course, he and Philip Hoare are the two great experts on Stephen Tennant.
Just a quickie to throw in there, and it's not about Tennant. Ivan Novello, the relationship between Sassoon and Ivan Novello, short-lived. Did it really happen?
I'm not sure about that. Of course, Ivan Novello was very close to Edward Marsh, and I think that was how they met each other, wasn't it? As far as I remember.
I mean, well, as far as I'm aware, I mean, Sassoon wrote that when the war was over, he was going to find that blighter who wrote "We keep the home fires burning" and shoot him.
Yeah.
Yes,
exactly.
He did meet him. I was wondering if there is any connection.
He did meet him.
Yes.
Yes.
If anybody can help me on that, I'd be most grateful.
Yes. Well, it would be interesting. Exactly.
Okay. Have we more or less come to an end, Kate? Or is that?
I think so. Yes. There's nothing else in the chat, unless anybody else has any further questions.
Yes, can I come in, please?
Oh, Meg, again, go for it.
Meg, the chair of the SSF for my sins. Thank you all very much. Particular thanks, of course, to Max and Viv and to Phil, a brilliant interviewer, and to Kate and Marcello and Deb for organising it all, and to everyone else for coming. And I hope this will be the first of many. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.